Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a story that, if I'm being honest, you might not survive if you're the kind of person who gets spooked easily. Because this isn't just another Tudor scandal. It's a slow descent into the dark, fractured mind of a king who began life as a golden prince and ended as a monster. Even he struggled to look at without trembling. Picture this with me. You're standing in a long stone corridor, the kind that swallows sound before you can tell whether you really heard anything at all. The kind lit by torches that flicker as if something unseen keeps brushing past them. At the far end of that corridor sits a heavy wooden door with iron hinges that look like they've carried centuries of grief. Behind it lies a man once adored, once worshipped, once envied, dying in a bed that smells of rot, sweat, and fear. He is enormous, diseased, decomposing slowly within his own flesh, gasping for breath as if the air itself is punishing him for the life he lived. And the moment his eyes begin to close, even for a heartbeat, he jerks awake with a hoarse cry, because as soon as darkness touches him, the faces arrive. The women he destroyed, the friends he betrayed, the ministers he executed. Faces shaped not by ghosts from beyond, but by the shattering edges of his own conscience. If that already gives you chills, then let me warn you gently, you will not survive this one if your nerves are even a little softer than that. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it for you right now? There's something strangely magnetic about people in different corners of the world, in different time zones, listening to the unraveling of a king's mind under the same quiet darkness. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The door opens with a slow, reluctant groan, revealing the final winter of the year, 1547. When Henry VIII, once the most dazzling prince in Europe, lies dying in a room thick with incense, meant to disguise the stench of the wound that has consumed half of his leg. The smell is overpowering, a suffocating mixture of infection and decay, and the bed beneath him creaks under the burden of his immense, swollen body. Servants whisper from a distance. Physicians hover helplessly. Even the candles seem reluctant to burn too close to him, their flames bending away from the gloom that clings to his skin. He tries to sleep, but the nightmares wait behind his eyelids like wolves. Catherine of Aragon appears first, her eyes full of dignity and sorrow. Then Anne Boleyn, sharp and brilliant, still proud even in memory. Next comes Jane Seymour, the sainted illusion he created because she died before she could disappoint him. Then Catherine Howard, trembling and young, reaching out just as she did on the final morning of her life, pleading for mercy he refused to give. Behind them stand Thomas More, Bishop Fisher, and the long parade of men he condemned to die for daring to tell him truths he did not want to hear. These are not spirits from the afterlife. They are the psychological specters of a mind that has been breaking for decades. But the story doesn't begin here. It doesn't begin with a rotting king drowning in his own guilt. It begins with a child, a beautiful, gifted, lonely child raised in a palace that offered praise, but never unconditional love. Henry grew up surrounded by tutors who monitored not just his education, but every flicker of emotion, reporting each change in mood to adults who saw him not as a boy, but as a symbol to be perfected. He learned early that affection could be withdrawn, that approval required performance, that love was a currency that had to be earned. And beneath all the golden privileges of royalty, an emptiness began forming in him, a hollow built from pressure and the absence of genuine warmth. Then his older brother Arthur died, and in a single night, Henry was pushed violently into a destiny meant for someone else. He inherited Arthur's title, Arthur's expectations, and eventually Arthur's widow, Catherine of Aragon. He was only 11 years old, a fragile age where identity should be taking shape, not being replaced. That moment carved a brutal lesson into his mind. If he could be replaced, others could be replaced too. And if his life could be redirected by force, then he had every right to redirect the lives of others when it suited him. As he grew into adulthood, Henry became the king no one expected him to be. Handsome, athletic, radiant, he dazzled Europe at first. But beneath that shining surface, trouble was taking root. The pressure of being perfect, the fear of inadequacy, the ravenous need for admiration, the terror of failure. These fractures grew with him, shaping a personality that modern psychologists would instantly recognize as deeply narcissistic. When Catherine of Aragon failed to give him a son, the cracks widened into chasms. Henry could not blame himself. He could not accept chance. And so he blamed God, then blamed fate, then blamed Catherine, reshaping morality itself to suit the story he needed to believe. Then came Anne Boleyn, enigmatic, sharp-witted, self-possessed, and Henry convinced himself she was destiny. He tore England away from Rome for her. He broke laws, broke marriages, broke friendships, and broke the unity of an entire kingdom. But when Anne gave birth to Elizabeth instead of the long-awaited son, when she miscarried the child he believed God had promised him, the fantasy he created around her shattered instantly. The same obsession that elevated her now turned to cold contempt, and the king who claimed he loved her more than life itself sent her to a French swordsman. Jane Seymour died after giving him a son, and because she never lived long enough to fail him, Henry sanctified her memory, convincing himself she was perfect. Anne of Cleves suffered for not reacting to him with the adoration his ego demanded. Catherine Howard suffered because he turned her trauma into evidence of betrayal. Only Catherine Parr survived by observing him carefully, soothing him strategically, and never allowing her intelligence to threaten the fragility of his ego. And now, in the final winter of his life, all of them gather inside the fading chambers of his mind. Not for vengeance, not for justice, but for the truth he spent a lifetime avoiding. The truth of who he became, and the truth of who he could never escape being. Henry's story does not begin with blood or executions or the thunder of royal decrees. It begins with a boy whose childhood felt less like a life and more like a polished cage. A place where every smile he received carried a condition, and every embrace came with expectations attached so tightly they left invisible bruises. As a young prince, Henry lived under constant surveillance tutors who were not merely teachers, but informants. Attendants who were not simply caretakers, but record keepers. All of them watching him, judging him, shaping him, reporting his every reaction to adults who saw him not as a child with fears and longings, but as a future emblem of Tudor perfection. In those early years, he learned something fatal: that affection was a performance, that emotions were tools, that love could be withheld to correct him, and that the only safe version of himself was the version others approved of. So he became charming, talented, obedient, a master at presenting whatever emotion earned him praise, while quietly bearing the parts of himself that felt fragile or uncertain. He grew into a boy who excelled at everything placed before him: music, languages, theology, horseback riding, archery, and everyone around him celebrated him for it, but not in the gentle way children need. They praised him as if he were a prize, a trophy, a creature bred for excellence. No one asked what troubled him. No one offered him the kind of love that allows a child to fail without fear. And because he never received that love, he learned to demand it from the world in ways that would become increasingly destructive. The seeds of narcissism were planted not by cruelty, but by conditional affection. By parents who loved him only through the lens of ambition. By a system that taught him power was something he deserved simply for existing. Then came the moment that transformed everything: the death of his older brother Arthur. Henry was only 11 years old when the world cracked beneath him, not from grief, but from the violent rearrangement of identity that followed. In a single night, he went from spare to heir, from second son to future king, from a boy expected to shine to a boy expected to carry the entire weight of the Tudor dynasty. He was ushered into Arthur's rooms, handed Arthur's possessions, taught Arthur's responsibilities, and in time guided toward Arthur's widow, Catherine of Aragon, as though lives and marriages were pieces of furniture that could be rearranged without consequence. That night was so quiet and dim that even the candles seemed hesitant to burn. Henry learned something that would haunt every relationship he ever had. He was replaceable. And if he could be replaced, then so could everyone else. He tried to mold himself into the vision others projected onto him. But that kind of transformation leaves wounds beneath the surface. When he eventually became king in the year 1509, the world saw a radiant young monarch, tall, athletic, golden-haired, eager to impress, but they could not see the fractures beneath that brightness. They could not see how deeply he feared failure, or how intensely he needed to be admired, or how desperately he wanted to control the narrative of his own worth. Power did not soothe Henry. It magnified everything inside him, and the affection he had been denied as a child became something he demanded from his subjects, his wives, his friends, even from God himself. In those early years, Henry was not yet the tyrant he would become. He tried to be fair, tried to be beloved, tried to rule with the kindness he wished he had known as a boy. But inside him, pressure built like steam beneath a sealed lid. Every year added to his reign deepened the cracks between the man he performed and the man he actually was. Catherine of Aragon loved him fiercely, loyally, wholeheartedly, but she loved him as a human being, not as a divine figure. And Henry, shaped by a lifetime of conditional affection, did not know how to endure a love that included disappointment or compromise or honest reflection. When she could not bear him a son, when fate placed a daughter in the cradle instead of a boy he could parade as the future of England, Henry felt the old childhood terror rise again, the fear of failing the story others had written for him. He began searching for explanations that preserved his self-image. He could not be the problem, so Catherine became the problem. God must have turned against the marriage. Destiny must have marked it as cursed. When Anne Boleyn entered his life with her sharp mind, her French polish, her refusal to bow before him like every other woman had done, Henry saw not a person, but a solution. It was the same pattern he had lived since childhood. When one version of reality displeased him, he replaced it with another. Catherine had not failed him. She had simply stopped fitting the role he needed her to play. So he pushed her aside, not with immediate cruelty, but with a slow, creeping withdrawal, letting his disappointment turn into justification until the idea of ending the marriage became not only reasonable, but righteous. Anne was everything Henry needed her to be at first: mysterious, intelligent, self-possessed, unwilling to be conquered too quickly. He constructed an entire myth around her, believing she had been sent by God, believing she could give him the son Catherine had not, believing she would heal every wound inside him through the act of giving him an heir. His obsession became a quest. His quest became a crusade, and his crusade became a national disaster. To love Anne the way he did, Henry had to reshape reality itself, break with Rome, rewrite the laws, defy the Pope, dismantle centuries of tradition, ignite a religious war, and convince himself that this was destiny, not destruction. Through all of this, the fractures in Henry's psyche widened until they no longer felt like cracks. They felt like the fault lines of a continent shifting. The Golden Prince still lived in his mind, but he was buried beneath the weight of expectations he had never learned to navigate. And as his internal world grew darker, as the pressure of producing a son grew unbearable, Henry became a man who could not love without demanding control, who could not face failure without assigning blame, and who could not look at himself without rewriting the truth to keep his ego from shattering completely. Anne would feel the consequences of that. So would Jane. So would Catherine Howard. So would England. And by the time Henry reached the rotting deathbed where we found him in part 1, the boy he had once been was nothing more than a ghost, one far sadder than any he imagined were haunting him in his final nights. Catherine of Aragon did not enter Henry's life like a storm or a prophecy or a seduction. She entered quietly, already carrying the grief of another world, already marked by the ghost of Arthur, the brother Henry had spent years pretending not to envy. She had been Arthur's wife for only a few months before death claimed him, leaving her stranded in a foreign kingdom, a young widow waiting for decisions made by men who treated women like treaties rather than human beings. When she married Henry years after Arthur's death, it was less an act of romance and more the final adjustment in a political puzzle carved out long before either of them had the strength to resist it. But Henry, still young, still idealistic, still glowing with the hopefulness of a prince becoming king, convinced himself that this was love, or at least destiny. Catherine admired his mind, soothed his insecurities, steadied him when he wavered. And Henry, starved for unconditional affection since childhood, clung to her approval with a kind of tender desperation he never fully understood. At first, their marriage was warm, almost gentle. Catherine saw the cracks inside him and tried to fill them with the sort of patience only a woman who had already tasted sorrow could possess. She prayed with him, laughed with him, debated theology with him, and, in the earliest years, believed wholeheartedly that they could rule England side by side in harmony. Henry returned that love fiercely, not because he understood partnership, but because he loved the version of himself that Catherine reflected back at him, a prince who was wise, virtuous, beloved, almost saintly. Catherine believed in his goodness so thoroughly that he began to believe in it himself, building his identity around her faith in him the way vines cling to a polished wall. But vines grow, and walls crack. The first fracture came quietly, carried by fate disguised as biology. Catherine's pregnancies began with hope and ended with heartbreak miscarriages, stillbirths, infants who lived only hours. Each loss carved something out of her, something tender and vulnerable. And Henry, terrified of feeling helpless, began to withdraw. He paced during the nights, reciting prayers that felt increasingly hollow, asking why God refused to bless him with a son, never daring to ask why he believed he deserved one in the first place. With each failed pregnancy, the echo of his own childhood returned the pressure, the expectations, the demand that he fulfill a destiny larger than his own desires. If he could not produce a son, he risked becoming the one thing he feared most replaceable. Catherine's sorrow deepened her humility. Henry's sorrow sharpened his ego. It was not a fair transformation, but it was inevitable. She held on to hope with a soft, steadfast faith, praying for another chance, another child, another miracle. Henry, on the other hand, felt the years pressing against him like a tightening band, squeezing the gentle parts of him until they thinned and frayed. He still cared for Catherine deeply, even affectionately, but the affection began to sour under the weight of disappointment. Every time he saw her, he did not see the wife he loved. He saw the threat of failure, the shadow of inadequacy, the reminder that he had not yet proved himself worthy of the story others demanded he fulfill. As the years passed, their conversations shifted from warm to polite, from polite to strained, and from strained to silent. Catherine sensed the distance growing between them, but her faith in Henry's goodness convinced her that the distance was temporary, a storm they could weather with prayer, patience, and duty. She loved him as a man. Henry, however, needed to be loved as a king. Catherine offered him devotion. Henry wanted validation. The love she gave was real, human, imperfect. The love he craved was worship. The shift became unmistakable the day Catherine's final pregnancy ended in heartbreak once again. Henry stood beside her bed, hands clenched, jaw tight, eyes unfocused. He murmured something that was neither comfort nor accusation, just a hollow sound meant to fill the air, while his thoughts raced toward places he dared not speak aloud. That night, Henry knelt before a crucifix and prayed not for Catherine's health, but for a sign that he was destined for something more, for someone else, for a future where a son would secure his legacy. In those quiet hours, long before Anne Boleyn ever entered his life, the marriage began to crumble, not with noise, but with a whisper. Catherine did not understand what she had lost until she saw it reflected in Henry's eyes. He still spoke kindly to her, still touched her hand in public, still walked beside her during processions. But the warmth had drained from him like water slipping through fingers. He began surrounding himself with younger men scholars, poets, theologians who fed the flames of his ego, who told him he carried divine purpose, who murmured theories about Old Testament laws that forbade marriage to a brother's widow. These ideas did not begin as solutions, they began as excuses, soothing Henry's sense of cosmic injustice. But excuses, when repeated often enough, grow roots. It was during this fragile period when Henry's dissatisfaction simmered and Catherine's hope clung to fading threads that Anne Boleyn stepped into the court. Sharp eyes, sharp mind, sharp wit, a spark of intellect wrapped in the elegant discipline of French court culture. She walked through the palace not like a temptress, but like a woman who understood her worth so clearly that she did not need to offer it to anyone. And Henry, always looking outward for what he could not find inside himself, felt his attention shift. Catherine felt it too, the way all women feel the change in a man long before he confesses it, even to himself. At first, Henry tried to resist the pull toward Anne, convincing himself he was merely intrigued, not enthralled. But Catherine watched the danger grow like a storm forming far beyond the horizon. Subtle at first, then undeniable. Theirs had been a marriage built on loyalty. But Henry was a man who had never learned how to distinguish loyalty from duty. And when a king's desires collide with his fears, the desires usually win. Catherine prayed harder. Henry avoided her more. And in the empty space between them, destiny twisted itself into something neither of them could have imagined. Not a love triangle, but a political earthquake, a spiritual rupture, a psychological unraveling that would reshape the entire kingdom. Catherine would soon find herself pleading for a marriage she believed sacred. Henry would soon find himself rewriting the laws of England to justify a truth he needed more than he believed. And Anne would soon discover that stepping into the role of Henry's obsession meant stepping onto a stage where love was indistinguishable from danger. Henry's fascination with Anne Boleyn did not ignite like a wildfire. It began as something much quieter, a subtle hum beneath the noise of court life, a shift so slight that only Catherine felt the temperature change. Anne moved through the palace with a kind of self-possession that unsettled Henry precisely because it contrasted so sharply with what he expected from women. She did not bend. She did not blush. She did not melt under the king's gaze the way others did. Instead, she held his attention by refusing to surrender hers. Henry had spent his entire life being pursued, worshipped, adored, and now, for the first time, he found himself leaning forward, reaching outward, chasing, and that unfamiliar sensation, desire, wrapped in frustration, did something electric to him, something intoxicating and dangerous. At first, he told himself it was harmless, a flirtation, a pleasant distraction, a spark of novelty in the otherwise suffocating routine of duty and ritual. But desire, when mixed with the wounded ego of a man raised on conditional love, grows into something more potent than affection. It becomes obsession, and Henry was a man built for obsession, a man who believed deeply in the idea that the universe had a narrative prepared for him, one in which everything he wanted was not merely permissible but destined. When Anne refused the role of mistress and withheld her affection with intelligent precision, Henry interpreted her resistance not as boundary, but as cosmic choreography, as though her refusals were signs from the heavens urging him forward. Meanwhile, Catherine felt her influence slipping through her fingers like water. She prayed harder, stood taller, performed her duties with even greater devotion, hoping that goodness alone could restore what had been lost. But goodness does not cure narcissistic insecurity. Henry saw not her loyalty, but her limitations. And each time Catherine spoke of conscience or tradition or morality, Henry felt a tightening in his chest, a reminder of the expectations he had failed to meet, the son he did not have, the legacy he could not secure. The more Catherine anchored herself in faith, the more Henry drifted toward the intoxicating promise of reinvention, something Anne represented simply by standing her ground. This delicate balance collapsed when Henry convinced himself, with the help of ambitious scholars and self-serving clerics, that his marriage to Catherine had been cursed from the start. He seized upon Old Testament verses, theological fragments, half-formed whispers from academics who saw opportunity in the king's turmoil. The idea began to take shape. Marrying his brother's widow had been a sin, a transgression, a violation of divine law, and therefore God had closed Catherine's womb. This interpretation did not come from humility or repentance. It came from desperation, disguised as revelation. Henry needed a narrative in which he was righteous. Catherine was the obstacle, and Anne was the answer heaven had withheld until now. Once that idea rooted itself inside him, it bloomed with frightening speed. Henry asked Rome for an annulment, but Catherine fought with the ferocity of a woman who understood that losing this marriage meant losing everything: her crown, her dignity, her identity, and the safety of her daughter Mary. She insisted the marriage was valid, consummated, blessed, legitimate. She insisted she had loved Henry faithfully, and she insisted, with a quiet courage that only inflamed Henry's rage, that the truth mattered more than his desires. It was the same moral strength Henry had once admired in her, now transformed into the very trait he resented most. Rome stalled, debated, delayed. The Pope hesitated not out of uncertainty, but because Catherine's nephew, Charles V, ruled half of Europe and would not tolerate humiliation. Henry, accustomed to adoration, felt insulted by resistance. His ego, already strained by years of disappointment, shattered into outrage. The boy who had been taught to earn love through perfection now faced a world that refused to bend to him, and instead of confronting the pain within himself, he rewrote the world around him. Thus began the long unraveling. A king's wounded ego became a national crisis. Every sermon, every letter, every whisper in court became evidence in the mounting storm. Henry convinced himself he had been chosen by God to correct a terrible injustice. And because he believed his desires were divine instruction, anyone who opposed him became not merely political enemies, but spiritual traitors. Catherine was stripped from the center of his life, relegated to lonely palaces, separated from her daughter, her attendance reduced, her possessions seized. She wrote letters pleading for justice, for dignity, for the chance to see Henry's face again, not as a queen demanding rights, but as a woman begging her husband to remember he had once loved her. Anne watched all of this with a blend of hope and growing unease. She had wanted Henry's affection, yes, but she had not expected the tidal wave of destruction he unleashed to possess her. The king who tore down mountains for her could one day bury her beneath them. Still, she pressed forward, trusting in the narrative Henry had built around their union. She believed that the righteousness he assigned to their love would shield her from the cruelty he inflicted upon others. She believed that passion meant permanence. In the year 1533, Henry defied Rome entirely and declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, a title woven from ego and fear, crowned with theological vanity. This single act cracked Europe like ice beneath a hammer. Monasteries trembled, priests fled. The old world gasped as Henry slaughtered tradition to rebuild it in his own image. And through all the chaos, all the blasphemy, all the political carnage, Anne stood at his side, radiant and trembling, carrying the child Henry believed would vindicate every sin committed along the way. But fate does not bend to desire. Anne's child, born on a cold September day, was a girl Elizabeth fiery, intelligent, destined for greatness. But Henry did not yet know destiny. He saw only disappointment, the same disappointment he had tasted for years, the same disappointment he had spilled Catherine's life for. And in that single moment, as he held his daughter and forced a smile, he did not feel a new crack open inside him, a fresh wound that would soon bleed into every corner of Anne's fragile world. Anne, radiant in triumph only hours earlier, felt the shift like a draft of cold air slipping between the seams of a door she had believed sealed. She held Elizabeth close, whispering promises the child could not yet understand. Promises built on fear and determination. She knew what Henry expected. She knew what he believed destiny owed him. And she knew that queens who failed Henry did not fade quietly, they shattered violently. For now, Henry still adored her. But the distance between adoration and destruction in Henry's mind was thinner than paper, and Anne had just taken her first step across it. Henry's disappointment after Elizabeth's birth did not explode outward like a thunderstorm. It seeped into the air like a slow poison, invisible at first, almost scentless, but unmistakable to anyone living close enough to breathe it in. Anne sensed it before he ever spoke a word, sensed it in the stiffness of his shoulders when he entered her chambers, in the slight narrowing of his eyes when he glanced at the cradle, in the faint tremor at the corner of his mouth when courtiers congratulated him with forced enthusiasm. His love, once fierce enough to split a kingdom from Rome, began cooling in a way that terrified her, because it did not come with arguments or accusations, but with silence. And silence from Henry VIII was always a precursor to something far more dangerous than anger. Anne tried to hold him with conversation, with wit, with charm, with the fierce intelligence that had once inflamed him. But Henry no longer sought stimulation. He sought comfort, validation, simplicity, a softness Anne was never designed to embody. Her brilliance, once intoxicating, now made him feel scrutinized. Her independence, once alluring, now made him feel insufficient. Her ambition, once celebrated, now felt threatening. Each day, as she recovered from childbirth, she watched the man who had once sworn he could not live without her drift toward a colder version of himself, a version forged not by passion, but by fear. Fear in Henry always demanded a target. Anne quickly realized the court had shifted its shape as well. The nobles who once whispered admiration now whispered impatience. The courtiers who once bowed deeply now bowed just slightly less. The dukes and ambassadors who had once competed for her attention now watched her with the morbid curiosity of people waiting for a magnificent structure to collapse. Even her ladies, those assigned to her, not chosen by her, exchanged uneasy glances when she passed, as though they had already seen the future and were frightened by how close it felt. Each room she entered seemed to inhale sharply before exhaling her name like a warning. Henry began spending more time away from her chambers, often in the company of those who nurtured his insecurities rather than challenged his reasoning. Among them moved a quiet young woman named Jane Seymour, pale and delicate, trained from childhood to survive by being unobtrusive. Jane never competed for attention. She never offered opinions without being asked. She lowered her gaze in a way that made Henry feel tall, important, unchallenged. It was the exact opposite of Anne's presence, which had always demanded engagement. Henry discovered, to his secret shame, that he found relief in Jane's silence. Anne noticed, not because Jane made any bold move, she did nothing bold at all, but because Henry's gaze began shifting, just slightly, toward the woman who did not threaten him. The same pattern Catherine had once felt now repeated itself, like a haunting melody returning for another verse. Anne tried to ignore it at first, reminding herself that Henry's passion had always been mercurial, that it would rekindle when she gave him the long-awaited son, and for a brief moment, destiny seemed willing to give her that chance. She became pregnant again. For several weeks, the palace softened. Henry visited more often. His hands lingered on her shoulders. His voice regained some of its warmth. Courtiers smiled, sensing that a son might finally silence the controversy that had divided England. Anne placed her hands on her swelling stomach each night and whispered prayers that trembled between hope and desperation. She imagined a boy with Henry's golden hair and her dark eyes, imagined him quieting the storms around her, imagined Henry lifting him in triumph as proof that everything they had sacrificed had not been in vain. But hope is fragile, especially in the hands of a king accustomed to bending fate to his will, and fate does not bend. One winter afternoon, after a heated argument in which Anne confronted Henry about Jane Seymour's growing presence, the stress pierced her body like a knife. She collapsed, And by the time the midwives arrived, the world inside her had already begun to unravel. The child was lost. Some whispered it had been a boy. Others claimed they saw only blood. But when Henry learned of the miscarriage, he did not rush to her bedside in grief. He stood still, pale, utterly silent, as if the blow had struck not Anne but the last fragile illusion he had been clinging to. When he finally approached her, his expression held no tenderness, only something cold and unrecognizable. Anne reached for him, her voice trembling, insisting she had been frightened by the argument, that fear had broken her body, not her failure. But Henry's eyes did not soften. They hardened, because to believe Anne meant accepting that Henry, the king, the chosen one, had caused the death of a child, and Henry's mind could not bear guilt. So, as always, he rewrote the truth. The miscarriage was Anne's fault. The disappointment was Anne's fault. The instability was Anne's fault. Henri used to say God punished sin. Now he believed God punished mistakes. The court moved quickly, like animals smelling weakness. They circled her with whispers sharp enough to cut skin. They muttered about her temper, her political meddling, her flirtations, her confidence. They blamed her for England's instability, as if one woman carried the weight of every fear and frustration that had festered since the break with Rome. And behind these whispers walked Thomas Cromwell, silent, calculating, his gaze shifting from Anne to Henry, as though he were measuring the distance between them and calculating how much force would be required to push her into the abyss. Anne tried to fight back in the only way she knew, by speaking, by reasoning, by reminding Henry of the years he had spent building their life brick by brick. But Henry did not want memories. He wanted absolution. And Anne, once the woman he believed was heaven's gift, now became the vessel for every disappointment he refused to carry. The coldness in him grew like frost on a window pane, spreading outward in delicate, lethal patterns. Henry no longer dismissed Anne's enemies. He listened to them. He no longer defended her innocence. He questioned it. He no longer saw her as destiny. He saw her as the barrier between himself and the son he believed God had promised him. And in the darkest hours of the night, as Anne stood alone in her chambers, the silence around her began to change. It no longer felt like the pause between storms. It felt like the breath before a blade falls. Cromwell did not attack in the open. He never had to. He understood better than anyone that the most lethal traps are not the ones that snap loudly, but the ones that tighten so gradually their victim does not realize she is trapped until she can no longer breathe. And now, with Henry's affection cooling into something brittle and unpredictable, Cromwell sensed that the king was ready, not consciously, perhaps not openly, but psychologically, for someone to blame, someone to sacrifice, someone whose fall would cleanse the disappointments he could not acknowledge as his own. Anne was already slipping. Cromwell merely needed to give gravity a little nudge. The rumors began as whispers so faint they could have been nothing more than the soft hiss of the wind beneath the palace doors. A laugh held too long with a court musician, a conversation carried out of context, a glance misinterpreted, then repeated, then sharpened. Men who once adored Anne now recoiled at her intelligence, viewing every witty remark as evidence of impropriety, every act of kindness as manipulation, every frown as treason. The fragile ecosystem of the Tudor court, already poisoned by fear, ambition, envy, and insecurity, began mutating into something darker. Anne, who had once commanded the room with the effortless radiance of a woman chosen by a king, now found the same room shifting around her like a labyrinth designed by someone who wanted her to lose her way. Henry drifted through these days in a haze of discontent, already grieving the child he insisted had been promised to him. He avoided Anne's gaze. He avoided her touch. He avoided any conversation that required him to reflect on the choices that had brought them here. He convinced himself he was the victim, that Anne had bewitched him, that she had manipulated him with her intellect and seduced him into sin. It was easier to believe he had been tricked than to believe he had been wrong. And Cromwell, seeing this, began adding shape to Henry's unspoken fears. The shift became unmistakable when Henry discovered that Jane Seymour had been coached quietly, softly, strategically by those aligned with Cromwell. She now lowered her eyes with perfect modesty, kissed the king's hand with trembling reverence, and returned his small gestures of affection with the kind of delicate restraint that made Henry feel like a benevolent giant. Anne had always been fire. Jane was mist. Anne challenged him. Jane soothed him. Anne stoked his ego. Jane calmed it. Henry's mind, already starved for validation and peace, sank eagerly into the fantasy Jane represented a future without conflict, without sharp edges, without a queen who forced him to confront the uglier parts of himself. Anne saw it all happening, but she could not stop it, and the more desperate she became, the more she faltered. She confronted Henry at the wrong moments. She accused him at the wrong times. She sought reassurance from a man who no longer wished to provide it, and each plea, each tear, each fractured moment only deepened Henry's suspicion that she was unraveling, that she was guilty, that her failure was rooted in moral corruption rather than tragic circumstance. Henry did not want a wife who reminded him of his choices. He wanted a wife who erased them. Cromwell, sensing the precise moment when the king's heart cracked open to darkness, began weaving the net. He summoned frightened musicians, trembling servants, ambitious nobles eager to survive by feeding the monster they served. Mark Smeaton, cornered in a dim chamber, was interrogated until the terror inside him twisted his words into confessions he did not truly mean. Others, desperate to protect themselves, expanded on the lies, embellishing what Cromwell needed them to say. They spoke of adultery, of secret meetings, of whispered conversations that had never happened. They spoke of Anne's brother George with a cruelty that felt almost ritualistic, as though they needed to destroy not only the queen, but her entire bloodline to prove their loyalty to Henry. And Henry, who had already begun rewriting Anne's role in his story, received these accusations not with shock, but with relief because they allowed him to shift blame away from himself. If Anne were adulterous, then he had not destroyed Catherine for nothing. If Anne were treacherous, then the religious war he ignited had been justified. If Anne were morally corrupt, then he was not the flawed king who had been led astray by passion. He was the righteous king correcting a cosmic mistake. Cromwell gave Henry the narrative he needed, and Henry embraced it with the eagerness of a man drowning in his own ego. The first time guards appeared outside Anne's chamber, she felt a coldness spread through her bones like ink diffusing in water. It was not yet an arrest, not yet the moment of destruction, but it was a signal that her world was contracting. She tried to speak with Henry, but he dodged her with the casual cruelty of someone who had already decided she no longer mattered. Courtiers avoided her eyes. Ladies whispered behind their hands. Even the air felt thicker, as though the palace itself sensed the blood it was about to swallow. The last fragile illusion broke on a late April morning in the year 1536. Henry had left for a hunt, deliberately excluding her from the procession. Anne stood at her window watching the king's red cloak disappear into the woods, and in that instant, she felt a clarity so sharp it nearly split her in two. She was no longer his wife. She was no longer his chosen. She was no longer protected by the crown she wore. She was nothing more than a problem to be removed. And beneath her fear lay a truth she could barely whisper to herself. She had seen this happen to Catherine. She had been part of the mechanism that destroyed a queen. She knew exactly how the silence, the distance, the rumors, and the sudden politeness of courtiers aligned into a noose, but knowing did not help her escape it. Later that very evening, Cromwell met privately with the king. The details of that conversation have been lost to time, but the result became clear in the way Henry emerged cold, resolute, and strangely energized, as though the decision to destroy Anne had given him the first sense of purpose he had felt in months. By the next sunrise, the plan was set. The charges were ready, the list of accused men had been drafted, and the tower, ancient and hungry, began preparing for the arrival of a queen. Anne, unaware of the exact moment her fate had crystallized, prayed for strength. but the walls around her had already begun shifting inward, narrowing the space she had left to breathe. The morning the arrest began arrived with an eerie gentleness, the kind of pale, trembling light that makes the world feel suspended between reality and a dream, as though dawn itself were hesitating before illuminating something too cruel to witness. Anne woke before the sun, her heart already beating with an anxious rhythm she could not explain. The palace corridors were unusually quiet, the air too still, the servants too subdued, their movements careful in a way that felt unnatural. It was the kind of silence that comes not from peace, but from anticipation, the hush of a crowd holding its breath before a blade falls. Anne sensed it immediately. It clung to her skin, whispering warnings her mind tried desperately to dismiss. The first sign came in the form of footsteps measured, heavy, official approaching her chambers with a precision that made her blood turn cold. When the door opened, she saw Sir Henry Norris standing with an expression torn between duty and horror. Behind him stood guards, their faces set, their hands resting on the hilts of their weapons, though they had no intention of using them. Norris bowed, but the bow felt like a farewell, and Anne's breath caught in her throat. She asked whether the king had summoned her. He hesitated. Then he said words that felt like the ceiling collapsing. Henry wanted her questioned regarding matters of grave concern. No accusation was spoken aloud, but the air around her vibrated with implication. Before she could gather her thoughts, another announcement arrived. Mark Smeaton had been arrested the night before, taken to Cromwell's chambers, and had not been seen since. Anne felt the room tilt, as if gravity itself had betrayed her. Smeaton was a gentleman, a musician, one of the few souls who had shown her uncomplicated kindness during her rise. For his name to be spoken in the same breath as this dark summons meant only one thing: Cromwell had already begun building the case meant to crush her. She asked where Mark was now. Norris did not answer. He did not have to. As Anne walked through the palace, escorted by men who refused to meet her eyes, she felt the walls watching her with the cold detachment of witnesses who had seen this ritual played out before. Catherine of Aragon had walked similar halls. Countless courtiers had taken similar steps. And Anne realized with a bone-deep dread that she was not entering a hearing, she was entering a sentence already passed. Each face she passed seemed to retreat into the shadows, not out of malice but out of fear. To be seen sympathizing with Anne now was to risk falling into the same abyss. The interrogation chamber was surprisingly small, dimly lit, and suffocatingly warm. Cromwell sat at the table, his expression meticulously shaped into something neutral, but his eyes gleamed with the coldness of a man who believed he was acting on the will of God, or perhaps the will of a king whose desires had replaced conscience entirely. He greeted Anne with courtesy, the kind that cuts deeper than cruelty, then began his questions in a tone that seemed almost gentle, but each question was a barb disguised as silk. Why had she spoken with Mark Smeaton in private? Why had she laughed with Henry Norris? Why had she spoken of dead men's shoes with Francis Weston? Did she understand how easily her gestures could be misinterpreted? Anne answered truthfully, but truth had no traction in this room. Cromwell was not collecting explanations, he was collecting material. Every denial became an opportunity to twist her words. Every memory she offered became a knife he sharpened. At one point, she faltered not because she was guilty, but because she realized guilt no longer mattered. The questions were not aimed at discovering truth. They were aimed at constructing a narrative, shaping a story, carving out the shape of treason so Henry could fill it with the weight of her life. By midday, she was told she must remain under guard. Not arrested, not yet, but contained, controlled, observed. She returned to her chambers and found that half her attendants had vanished. Those who remained avoided her gaze, hands trembling as they poured water or fetched clothing. Anne sat in the center of the room, her breath shallow, her mind racing through every moment of her life with Henry, searching for the point where destiny had slipped from her fingers. Outside her window, the palace moved like a beast stirring after a long sleep, and she felt the sense of inevitability settle over her like a shroud. The next morning quiet, gray, unwelcome brought the moment Anne already knew was coming. Sir William Kingston arrived at her door, his expression carved from sorrow. He informed her that she was under arrest for adultery, incest, and high treason. The words struck her like blows. She felt her legs weaken. She gripped the back of a chair to steady herself, shaking from head to toe. She asked who had accused her. Kingston hesitated. Then he lowered his gaze and said nothing. Because the truth was more horrible than any name he could have spoken. It was Henry. Whether consciously or through the poisonous narrative Cromwell had fed him, Henry had accepted these accusations because they allowed him to escape the prison of his own guilt. Anne begged to see the king, to speak with him, to explain. Kingston told her gently that this would not be possible. She asked about Elizabeth. He assured her the child was safe. Safe but without her. That was when Anne broke. Not into screams, not into rage, but into a trembling sorrow so deep it seemed to hollow out her ribs. She clutched her chest as if trying to hold herself together. The guards, moved despite themselves, looked away. She was escorted to the barge waiting on the river. The Thames, heavy and metallic, reflected no sunlight that day. It looked like a blade. Anne stepped aboard, trembling violently, her breath catching in rapid, uneven gulps. As the barge drifted toward the Tower of London, she watched the palace recede behind her, its windows glinting like indifferent eyes. The river's cold wind whipped her hair across her face, and the sound of the oars dipping into the water echoed like a heartbeat counting down. The tower loomed ahead, enormous and ancient, its stones darkened by centuries of despair. Traitor's Gate yawned open, a mouth waiting to swallow her whole. When the barge slid beneath the archway, Anne felt a chill so deep it seemed to seize her spine. She stepped onto the stone steps, stumbled once, then forced herself upright. Kingston walked beside her, not leading but accompanying, as though escorting someone already halfway into the shadow of death. Inside the tower, she was taken not to a dungeon, but to the royal apartments, the very rooms Henry had ordered refurbished for her coronation just 3 years earlier. The irony was not lost on her. Those gilded chambers, once symbols of triumph, were now her cage. Anne pressed her hand against the cold wall, feeling its ancient pulse, and in the stillness she realized the truth she had tried so hard to outrun the moment Henry stopped loving her. She had ceased to exist. That night, she could not sleep. She paced, she prayed, she wept silently into her pillow. She thought of Elizabeth, of her bright eyes, of her tiny fingers curling around Anne's hand, and the ache in her chest became unbearable. When she finally collapsed onto the narrow bed, trembling, she whispered to the darkness that she had loved Henry, truly loved him, and that love had led her into the jaws of a beast she had helped awaken. In the corridor outside, the guards shifted their weight uneasily, listening to the faint sound of a queen breaking. The tower did not rush her. It never rushed anyone. Its cruelty worked like a slow tide, seeping through stone, settling into the lungs, thinning the air until every breath felt borrowed. Anne spent her first full day in the royal apartments suspended between the numbness of shock and the piercing clarity of fear, pacing in long, trembling lines across floors that had once echoed with the footsteps of her coronation procession. Now each step sounded like a countdown. The sunlight through the narrow windows was thin and cold, illuminating nothing but dust drifting aimlessly through a room that had become too large for one woman's despair. She tried to pray, but the words tangled in her throat. She tried to eat, but her stomach clenched violently at every attempt. And she tried, above all, to believe this nightmare could still be undone. But the tower's silence made liars of such hopes. The interrogations began without ceremony. Kingston arrived with soft knocks, always polite, always sorrowful, always accompanied by men who carried quills and parchment instead of weapons, yet felt infinitely more dangerous. They asked about Norris, about Smeaton, about Weston, about her brother George. They asked about glances, about gestures, about jokes spoken months or years before. twisting harmless memories into something grotesque. Every question sounded innocent until she answered. Then her answers were turned inside out and laid before her, like traps she had unknowingly set for herself. Cromwell's fingerprints were everywhere in the way the inquiries were shaped, angled, leading, subtle at first, then sharpened each time she showed fear. Anne tried to defend herself with the truth. She tried to insist that she had only spoken kindly to the musicians, that her conversations with Norris were nothing but courtly courtesy, that the joke about dead men's shoes had been spoken in jest. But truth in that chamber dissolved like salt in water. Her denials were recorded, twisted, reframed until they became shadows of the very lies Cromwell needed to construct. When she realized this, when she saw the faint smirk drifting across one interrogator's lips as though he had already written her fate, she felt her voice weaken, not because she was guilty, but because she understood the futility of every word leaving her mouth. Outside her room, the tower hummed with a quiet dread. Prisoners past and present seemed to linger in its halls, not as ghosts but as echoes of footsteps, echoes of last breaths, echoes of whispered prayers that had never reached the heavens. Anne felt those echoes pressing against her from all sides. Even the ravens on the battlements stared through the windows with a knowing stillness, as though recognizing the scent of death moving closer. When she learned that Mark Smeaton had confessed, coerced, terrified, broken, she collapsed into a chair, gripping its edges as though the wood were the only thing keeping her tethered to the earth. She whispered his name again and again, unable to comprehend how a gentle musician could have been dragged into this nightmare. She begged Kingston for details, but he avoided her gaze, murmuring that he could not speak of what he did not know. But Anne knew. She understood the subtle brutality of Cromwell's methods. The confession had not been extracted. It had been manufactured. The days blurred. Morning and night became indistinguishable in the dim confines of her rooms. Each hour brought new rumors, new murmurs from guards trying and often failing not to pity her. She heard that Weston had been arrested, then Brereton, then Norris himself, the man Henry had trusted beyond measure. Then finally George, her beloved brother. When Kingston confirmed this, Anne's scream broke from her without warning, raw and primal, echoing through the corridor like a wounded creature. She clung to Kingston's sleeve, begging for mercy, begging for truth, begging for something, anything that would make this nightmare less monstrous. Kingston stood frozen, his eyes wet, because he understood what she did not yet accept. The king had not only turned against his wife, he had turned against all logic, all loyalty, all humanity. The trial was announced quickly, far too quickly for any real investigation to have taken place. Anne was escorted from her chambers in a procession that felt grotesquely ceremonial, as if the court sought to transform her suffering into entertainment. She wore a gown of dark damask, her head held high, her steps steady despite the trembling that threatened to unbalance her. As she was led into the hall, filled with more than 2,000 spectators, she felt a strange sensation wash over her, a strange clarity, a strange calm. If she was to die, she would die standing. The charges read aloud were monstrous, obscene, dripping with accusations so surreal they numbed the very air. Anne listened, her eyes fixed on the lords who had once bowed before her with reverence. Some refused to meet her gaze. Others, ashamed, glanced quickly away. A few held their heads high with brittle arrogance, eager to prove loyalty to a king who had abandoned loyalty himself. When Anne finally rose to speak, she did so with a quiet, devastating composure. She denied everything. She spoke of her devotion to Henry, of her innocence, of the absurdity of the claims brought against her. She did not plead. She did not bargain. She simply told the truth, knowing it would not save her, but wanting it preserved in the memory of anyone brave enough to listen. When the guilty verdict was pronounced, the hall seemed to inhale sharply. Anne accepted it with a small nod, her face pale but resolute. There was no outburst, no collapse, no dramatic scene. She had already understood her fate long before the words were spoken. The verdict was not born in that hall. It had been conceived in Henry's mind, nurtured in Cromwell's ambition, and forged into iron the moment the child within her had died. Back in the tower, she waited for the end with a grace that unnerved even the guards assigned to watch her. She spoke gently to the women attending her, comforted them when they cried, thanked Kingston for every kindness he offered. She prayed not for survival but for strength, for Elizabeth's future, for the ability to meet her death with dignity. She asked whether Henry would grant her a sword instead of an axe, and when Kingston confirmed he had indeed summoned a French executioner, a soft expression of relief crossed her face. Not joy, not peace, just relief that the end would be swift. The night before her execution, she did not sleep. The tower was too quiet, as though every stone had turned to listen. She sat by the narrow window, staring at the moon hanging low above the river, and she whispered to the darkness everything she could not say in life: her fear, her heartbreak, her regrets, her love for Elizabeth, her impossible hope that history would one day remember her as more than the caricature her enemies painted. And when dawn finally bled into the sky, pale and cold, she stood, smoothed her gown, and prepared herself for the final walk of her life. Dawn arrived not as a burst of light, but as a thin, hesitant glow that crept across the tower stones, like something afraid to touch the world it was entering. Anne felt it before she saw it, the subtle shift in the air, the faint chill that settles on the skin when night finally loosens its grip. She stood quietly as her ladies dressed her, their hands trembling so violently that Anne reached out at one point to steady one of them, whispering something gentle, something meant to calm, though her voice wavered just enough to betray the storm churning beneath her composed exterior. The gown she chose was dark and elegant, not as a final statement of vanity, but as an act of dignity, a reminder that even stripped of her crown, she would not surrender the grace that had carried her through every triumph and every terror of her brief reign. When Sir William Kingston arrived to escort her, his expression held the weight of a man who had witnessed too many tragedies carved into the stones of the tower. Anne thanked him for his kindness, the gratitude soft in her voice, and then stepped forward with a steadiness that startled even herself. The corridor outside was silent, except for the faint shuffle of guards attempting, and failing, to hide the emotion in their breaths. The tower seemed to exhale around her, its ancient walls absorbing the weight of another soul journeying toward its final chapter. Each step Anne took echoed softly, a rhythmic sound that matched the trembling beat of her heart. Outside, the air was gray and cool, the sky heavy with clouds that refused to break. The courtyard had already filled with spectators, nobles, soldier, servants, those who had once bowed to her, and those who had always watched from the shadows. They parted as she approached, not with the reverence once granted to a queen, but with an unsettling mix of awe, sorrow, and morbid fascination. The scaffold waited in the center, a pale wooden platform that seemed almost fragile in its simplicity, as if trying to disguise the horror it had been built to perform. The French executioner Henry had summoned stood at a respectful distance, his sword hidden beneath his cloak. He bowed deeply when Anne met his gaze, and she returned the bow with a small, steady nod. There was a brief flicker of something relief, gratitude, resignation in her eyes. The sword would be swift. There would be no axe, no repeated blows, no gruesome struggle. If she was to die, she would die quickly. It was a mercy granted not from love, but from a king eager to separate efficiency from the guilt he refused to confront. Anne ascended the steps of the scaffold with a composure that stunned the crowd into silence. The wind tugged gently at her gown, lifting its hem just slightly, as though the world itself recognized the fragility of the moment. She turned to face the people, drawing a long breath that steadied her trembling chest. When she began to speak, her voice carried across the courtyard in a tone neither loud nor weak, simply clear, shaped by a determination to meet death without bitterness. She spoke of her innocence without demanding absolution. She prayed for the king's long life without venom. She forgave those who had wronged her without naming names. It was not submission. It was not defeat. It was the final act of a woman who refused to let others dictate the last memory history would hold of her. As she finished, the courtyard remained painfully still. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if listening. Anne then removed her cloak, handed her prayer book to one of her ladies, and knelt upon the straw-strewn wood. She adjusted her posture with meticulous care, straightening her back, folding her hands, lifting her chin just enough to expose the clean line of her neck, all with the heartbreaking composure of someone determined to face terror with elegance. She asked her ladies not to cry loudly, because their grief might frighten her in her final moments. They tried to obey, but their muffled sobs shuddered through the air like broken wings. The executioner stepped quietly into position. He asked a guard to fetch his sword, performing the traditional distraction meant to turn the condemned's head. Anne instinctively shifted her gaze toward the guard, her eyes following the sound out of habit, perhaps even curiosity. And in that fraction of a moment, the executioner unsheathed the sword from beneath his cloak and raised it behind her. His movements fluid, practiced, almost gentle in their precision. The sword fell. It fell with a whisper rather than a scream, a clean arc slicing through the cool morning air before the crowd had even drawn their next breath. Anne's life ended in an instant so swift that the silence held its shape for a heartbeat before collapsing into gasps, sobs, and the soft thud of her body settling onto the straw. Her ladies dropped to their knees, their cries breaking through the fragile quiet of the courtyard, their hands trembling as they gathered her hair, her gown, her mortal remains with the tenderness of those trying to cradle something that has already slipped beyond their reach. The executioner bowed over the lifeless form, then stepped back, his task completed, his face unreadable. The crowd began to disperse slowly, as though unsure how to move through a world in which Anne Boleyn no longer existed. Some left with pity etched into their features. Others left with a hollow fear, knowing how easily favor could turn into doom. And a few left with triumphant relief, unaware that history would eventually expose their cruelty. Anne's body was carried to the nearby chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, laid to rest without ceremony, without grandeur, without the dignity her crown had once promised her. No marble monument, no procession, no royal mourning, just cold stone, hurried prayers, and the quiet weeping of the women who loved her. When news reached Henry, he did not mourn, he did not tremble, he did not pray. He dressed in white, perhaps in joy, perhaps in denial, perhaps in a twisted attempt to rewrite the narrative before anyone else could. And by the end of that very day, he was engaged to Jane Seymour, a living symbol of how easily he shed one life for another. But history remembers differently, because beyond the tower walls, in every village and every whispered story, Anne Boleyn lived on, through her courage, through the daughter she left behind, through the legacy she never got to witness. Elizabeth Tiny, abandoned, overlooked, would one day rise from the ashes of her mother's destruction and become one of the greatest monarchs the world has ever known. And Henry VIII, in the end, could not escape this quiet twist of fate. The woman he destroyed gave birth to the queen who would outshine him for centuries.